You can start.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Welcome, everyone. It's a proud privilege and honor for the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad, to host this academic event on alienation and freedom. We have two very distinguished speaker, Professor Akeel Bilgrami, who is the Sidney Morgenbessor Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University, and who is also a concurrent faculty member of the Committee on Global Thought. Professor Akeel, it's a privilege to welcome and host you in the department, and thank you once again for agreeing to discuss and converse with Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who is another very distinguished professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Thank you, Professor Prabhat, for coming and sparing your invaluable time with us today. Professor Akeel Bilgrami is no stranger to any one of us here, and he is a distinguished professor in Colombia for quite an extended period of time. Both Professor Akeel and Professor Prabhat share a commonality, which is that both were a Rhodes Scholar at University of Oxford, where they did their bachelor's degree in the 1960s and the 1970s. Professor Akil has subsequently did his PhD from the University of Chicago and taught briefly at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and subsequently has been teaching at Columbia University since then. And he has been chair of the philosophy department from 1994 to 1998. He has also been the director of the Hyman Center for the Humanities at the Columbia Universities and director of the South Asian Institute. Uh, Professor Akils has done quite an impressive corpus of work on issues pertaining to philosophy, to issue of moral psychology, and his work essentially straddles across how moral and political philosophy intertwine or intersect on issues of politics, culture, politics of on history, and issues of secularism, so and so forth. And some of the significant work of Professor Akeel Bilgrami include, among others, Belief and Meaning, Self-Knowledge and Resentment, Secularism, Identity, and Enchantment, which was published by the Harvard University Press in 2004. He has also edited uh, a very important work including Democratic Culture, Marx, Gandhi, and Modernity, and Beyond the Secular West. Professor Prabhat Patnaik, as I said, has also been a Rhodes Scholar. He did his double bachelor's in the sense that the bachelor's degree that he did from Oxford University is to the Indian terminology often considered as equivalent to the postgraduate degree. He subsequently obtained his PhD from University of Oxford. And after having taught at the Cambridge University, Professor Patnaik came to the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru Universities in 1974, and he had been professor since then at the center till he retires in 2010. Professor Prabhat Patnaik has retired as the Sukhumai Chair of Planning and Economics at the CESP in Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has been Vice Chairman of the Kerala State Planning Board from 2006 to 2011. And he has also been a member of the four-member High Power Task Force Committee of the United Nations, which was chaired by Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor Prabhat Patnaik has specialized on macroeconomics and political economy, and he has published very extensively on some of these important titles like Time, Inflation and Growth, Economics and Egalitarianism, Whatever Happened to Imperialism and Other Essays, Accumulation and Stability under Capitalism, The Retreat to Unfreedom, the value of money, re-envisioning socialism, and he has also been the editor of a very important social science journal called Social Scientist. It is a proud privilege once again to welcome both of them to this important academic event, which is hosted by the Department of Political Science. And we welcome esteemed colleagues and friends, not only from the University of Hyderabad, but also from different universities, not only in India, but from outside India, who has spared their invaluable time to partake in this very interesting and what promised to be a very fruitful academic discussion between these two distinguished speakers today. So, without coming in between the audience and the two distinguished speakers, may I hand over the time to the speakers? Let Professor Akeel and Professor Prabhat Patnaik take over in ways that they find it most convenient. After which, we'll be having a discussion of the presentation and Professor Sanjay Palshikar, who has also been a noted political theorist who worked very extensively on Indian political thought and other domains, would be the discussion today. And we'll be opening the floor for question and answer towards the end of the discussion as well. So, to start the discussion, may I request Professor Akeel and Professor Prabhat Patnaik to take over the floor now. Thank you once again for sparing your time and most welcome to this academic discussion. Professor Akeel and Professor Prabhat, please take over.
Prabhat, why don't you speak first?
How long should I speak for?
Uh, it depends. It depends if you want to be in a conversational mode. It's up to you to decide. Otherwise, maybe 30 to 40 minutes.
I think 30 minutes should be all right. 30,
yeah.
If we have 30, then there will be discussion time.
Yeah, great. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. First, Professor Swan, Akeel, Professor Palshi, Ranaga. First of all, let me thank you for this tremendous opportunity that I have of speaking to you. I'm very grateful, and particularly it's a pleasure speaking along with Akeel, whom I haven't met for a very long time, though we have, of course, met each other in this particular way on a couple of occasions during the lockdown. In the introduction to a contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx says that the individual, in the sense of the individual detached from the community, is a very late development. In fact, he's criticizing political economy, pre-Marxian classical political economy, on the grounds that actually a lot of writers in the political economy tradition begin as if the individual has been an eternal agent in the economic universe. As a matter of fact, Marx says that's not the case. The individual comes very late. In fact, the individual comes late, detached from the community, at a time when virtually the community itself is disintegrating, when it's broken up. And the means of the breaking up of the community in which the individual was placed is something which is what Marx had called the primitive accumulation of capital. A primitive accumulation of capital was, according to him, a forced smashing of the pre-capitalist property in order to make room for the introduction of capitalism. It, of course, had very many different moments, including colonial plunder and so on. But on the other hand, if you look at its internal aspects, at least two phenomena which are associated with it. One is the dispossession of the peasantry from agricultural operations or petty producers. That's a straightforward expropriation. And the other is the encroachment of the commons by private ownership. That this is something which actually makes pre-capitalist petty producers unviable, and therefore many of them are forced to abandon their occupations and look for work elsewhere. I mean, they become vagabonds in England and so on. So the process of primitive accumulation of capital is not just an economic process, a process which is accompanied by the destruction of the pre-capitalist community and the emergence of an individual which is detached from that particular community. Now, therefore, the very emergence of the individual is at the same time the emergence of a competitive individual, because that individual who's uprooted and becomes an individual, if you like, detached from the community, is unemployed, looking for a job, as indeed are other individuals, and therefore that individual emerges as a competitive individual. So the very emergence of an individual is the emergence of a competitive individual. That competitive individual is alienated from other individuals, is alienated from the community, which itself is disintegrating. And of course, when the person does find employment, the products that the individual is involved in producing as a part of a capitalist enterprise is alienated from that product itself. So that, the very emergence of the individual is the emergence of a competitive, alienated individual. But I believe that while these aspects of individual alienation are quite commonly discussed, but I believe there is a more basic alienation in capitalism, which Marx actually also occasionally discusses. And that is the fact that capitalism is essentially, a spontaneous system. It's a system in which there are immanent tendencies of the system which work themselves out through individuals, but individuals coerced into acting in particular ways. Marx, for instance, referred to the capitalist as capital personified, that the capitalist is not somebody who acts of his own volition. If a capitalist decided, instead of accumulating, to, let's say, go for a walk or go to spend his time in a museum, then that capitalist over time would actually get competed out. So it's a system in which everybody has a particular location, but you maintain that location by acting in particular ways. And of course, if you don't, then you lose your location in the system. Someone else comes and takes your place. Therefore, even that there is a more basic sense of alienation in capitalism, which arises from the fact that the individuals, and this includes both workers as well as capitalists, the individuals are coerced into acting in particular ways. They don't act out of their own volition. They are coerced into acting in particular ways by the fact of competition. And in that sense, everybody is alienated. That it's a system of general alienation, of course, not that everybody's alienation gives rise to the same consequences. The worker's alienation is accompanied by getting a subsistence wage, while the capitalist alienation is accompanied by getting a huge amount of profits. But on the other hand, they're both alienated in the sense that there is a general alienation where individuals act in ways which are not of their own volition. They act in ways where they're coerced into acting in these particular ways. Otherwise, you lose your place. The capitalist accumulates not because he enjoys accumulating, not necessarily because he enjoys accumulating. The capitalist accumulates because if he did not accumulate, then he would become smaller compared to others, in which case, since larger capital tends to take over smaller capital over a period of time through a process that Marx called centralization of capital, he would lose his place while others are going to take his particular place. So that is the way in which I would like to see the kind of alienation in capitalism, namely that no individual can act in ways which are of his or her own volition. Now, this is a fundamentally different conception. A conception, by the way, with which I agree. This is a fundamentally different conception from that of, let's say, kind of, bourgeois economics, from that of mainstream economics, because mainstream economics generally sees the individual as having existed throughout history. Capitalism itself, or Adam Smith talked about division of labor. You can talk about the emergence of the employer-employee relationship. All of it comes about because of individual volition and individuals agreeing to enter into certain kinds of relationships, as opposed to being forced to into positions, forced into positions of competition vis-a-vis others, and through that also being forced to act in particular ways. Now, this is a very different conception, and therefore I believe that in a very fundamental sense, capitalism is alienating in this particular way. Now, this alienation in capitalism, in turn, I believe, is not something which is only specific. I mean, it also has deeper roots, and competition does not begin with capitalism. Competition begins even before capitalism through commodity production. That commodity production, which itself tends to create differentiation, that some commodity producers grow, other commodity producers kind of come down in life, and commodity production, which produces differentiation, is also something which underlies the emergence of capitalism. In fact, even the act of primitive accumulation of capital, the process of primitive accumulation of capital, the process of dispossession by force of pre-capitalist petty producers, even though it is dispossession by force, it is something which in a concentrated manner abbreviates a whole historical process, but it itself is really, in a sense, part of a longer process of the development of commodity production. Invariably, for instance, when you had the enclosures happening, you had, by enclosure, I mean the enclosure movement in Britain, you actually had a situation where land use changed. You started producing crops which were in demand in the world market. And that in turn was because of the fact that the demands of commodity production actually made particular individuals who are obviously influential and so on, aided by the state, get rid of the smaller producers who had access to common land in order to appropriate that common land, in order to produce kind of crops which were in demand, and therefore to satisfy the requirements of commodity production. Now, therefore, I would say that the kind of alienation which I'm talking about, which basically means that individuals act in ways which are not of their own volition. Now, that is something which arises. Of course, capitalism capitalism characterizes this, but capitalism itself is something which is the denouement of a process of commodity production, and the process of commodity production itself gives rise to this differentiation, gives rise to this business of people having to act in ways which are not of their own volition. Now, here I would like to emphasize that by commodity production, I mean something very specific. In fact, I believe commodity production means something very specific. It's not just production for the market. There is a tremendous amount of confusion on this. It is believed that production for the market is simply commodity production. That's not true. In India, for instance, the local halwai in the street corner has been producing for the market for millennia, but he is not in a process of getting either pushed down into the ranks of the proletariat or pulled up into the ranks of the capitalists. In other words, the idea of commodity production giving rise to differentiation, giving rise to the development of capitalism at a certain stage, in fact, creating the situation of primitive accumulation, the phenomenon of primitive accumulation of capital, all that does not follow simply from producing for the market. I believe that a product becomes a commodity when it is a use value come exchange value for the buyer, but for the seller of the product, it is pure exchange value, pure amount of money. Now, the person who owns Walmart is not necessarily concerned about what goods are sold in a Walmart. He's concerned about the money. Therefore, for the seller, when the preoccupation is with the exchange value of the product, that is acting as a commodity, while for the buyer, of course, the buyer has to be concerned about the physical, chemical characteristics of the product. For the buyer, it is a use value and exchange value. But the fact that for the seller, it is a pure exchange value implies, in a sense, a kind of impersonality in the relationship between sellers or between buyers and sellers and so on. Therefore, the street corner shop, which has been going on for ages and ages, is something which is not producing a commodity, strictly speaking. Commodity production, to my mind, would be associated primarily, for instance, with long distance trade, where who you are producing for, you don't know. What market you are producing for, you don't know. There is a complete impersonality about between the buyer and the seller, between seller and seller, etc. Therefore, if I mean by commodity, if I take the meaning of commodity production to be that, then it would follow that that kind of commodity production then exercises a coercion. That kind of commodity production gives rise to differentiation. That kind of commodity production implies that the price crashes and you're wiped out. So large numbers of small producers get wiped out. So and that is why then the demand is that you must not remain small, that you must try and accumulate in order to become bigger so that you can survive such crisis. Otherwise, you would get wiped out. So what I mean by commodity production is a very special kind of production for the market. By special, I mean is widespread and historically important, but not every little act of producing for the market is actually commodity production. Now, I think this is something which has not been much appreciated in Marxist literature, because I believe that a lot of people think of commodity production simply as production for the market. And let me be very, very frank, this has actually given rise to substantial amount of ultra-left thinking within the Marxist movement. For instance, in China, the so-called Gang of Four actually said that because commodity production gives rise to capitalism, therefore is very important for us even to come down heavily on commodity production, including the petty producers, because the petty producers were seen as the hotbed from which capitalism is going to emerge. As a matter of fact, therefore, a lot of ultra-left activity in many communist societies has arisen because through an attack on petty production itself, which as a matter of fact has weakened the social base of the revolution and actually facilitated the emergence of actual capitalist production and actual restoration of capitalism. There is a misquote. I mean, okay, Lenin did say that petty production hourly, daily is producing capitalism, but that is one of those rhetorical flourishes which should not be taken literally. But if then one sees it this way, then it follows that the that just as the emergence of the individual is of an alienated individual, likewise, the overcoming of alienation must take the form of individuals coming together to form a new community. Now, Marx saw the emergence of this new community in terms of, first, the combinations, which were trade unions. In fact, there is a wonderful discussion in The Poverty of Philosophy in which Marx says that, look, trade unions are supposed to increase work. Why do workers join unions? They join unions to raise their wages. But in fact, fairly soon they find that the unions are completely incapable, really, of raising much wages. On the other hand, of the meager wages the workers get, they in fact make heavy contributions to keep the union going. Because, and this has baffled English economists, that if it is the case that the individual is interested in the union in order to get a better return, get a higher wage, then how come that they're actually losing out in the process of keeping the union going? This is where Marx says that the act of keeping the union going or keeping the combination going becomes more important than simply a calculation of wages. In a sense, that is when the individual has transcended pure individualism, has overcome, if you like, the alienated existence that he is forced to lead in the capitalism, and has actually joined a combination through which he expresses himself. So the point is that, but then the combination then leads on to, kind of further and further actions. Then Lenin said theory has to be brought to this combination from outside, and then it leads on to socialism. Now, I think there's something very important here also to keep in mind, that part of the spontaneity of capitalism consists in the fact that it is not a malleable system. You see, Keynes, for instance, thought that capitalism is a malleable system. You can muck about with it. You can have the state coming in and ensuring full employment and so on and so forth. That you can actually change the system in particular ways that you think is going to make it more viable, is going to keep off the socialist challenge and so on. If actually capitalism was a malleable system, then there'd be no case for socialism, because you can just make this system work in any way you like. But as a matter of fact, a part of my understanding of the spontaneity of the system consists in this, that it's not malleable, that if you actually tried to change the system in ways that you think would make it viable, desirable, and so on and so forth, then it would become dysfunctional. When it becomes dysfunctional, then of course, the state through which this malleability is supposed to be enforced would then have a choice, either to pull back or alternatively to carry out further interventions, which ultimately actually go beyond the system. So given that, the fact that combinations begin with interfering with the functioning of the system tolerates the combinations, but on the other hand, at a certain point, the system hits back against this. So there is a continuous tussle between the spontaneity of the system and an effort to alter it. And that tussle has no equilibrium point, no equilibrium position. You cannot really say that capitalism has now reached a point where this is going to be the norm from now on. When I was an undergraduate student, there was a book which had come out. There was Keynesian demand management. There was a lot of intervention in capitalism. People talked about welfare capitalism. People talked about full employment capitalism. Keynesianism was in the air. And a book came out, Has Capitalism Changed? It actually got a lot of very distinguished writers, Paul Sweezy, John Kenneth Galbraith, Shigeru Suru, and so on. And among them, the majority said, yes, capitalism has changed. As a matter of fact, the biggest communist theoretician in Britain, John Strachey, left the party saying that now capitalism is quite different. So the communist theory is all wrong now, or dated now. But you see, the point is that you look what's happening now. Trade unions have got greatly weakened because the system has hit back against them. You now have a situation where Keynesianism is something which is completely kind of, discounted by, and you have welfare capitalism sought to be rolled back. I'm not saying it has been rolled back, but the effort is to roll it back. So you have now once more the system reasserting itself, or the spontaneity of the system reasserting itself. Now, this is something which has appeared in the neoliberal era. In fact, I believe neoliberalism is a means of reasserting the spontaneity of the system. Because of this, combinations, which are the first step towards overcoming alienation as far as the workers are concerned, something then have to be carried forward towards changing the system, going beyond the system. And that, of course, is something that we understand. I mean, let's say Marx understood by socialism and so on. But here again, I'd like to make a point which is not, I mean, which I'd like to emphasize. You see that if it is the case that really capitalism is the acme of commodity production, then going beyond capitalism must mean going beyond commodity production. In other words, I believe that this whole idea, for instance, you have in China, socialist commodity production, or a socialist economy which actually increases GDP and thereby, I mean, gross domestic product, and thereby believes that it can actually bring about development of everybody that you the development of the productive forces. And if long distance trade, if export trade can give you a high rate of export-led growth, then of course you are in a sense marching towards socialism. I believe that's fallacious. I believe that, in fact, building socialism must mean overcoming commodity production. It cannot be done simply through export-led growth that like China is doing, because it invariably produces inequalities, it produces alienation. Because of competition, it actually forces down the conditions of the workers, etc. So I believe that socialism is incompatible with this export orientation, which to my mind is symptomatic of commodity production. You look at India, for instance, in this period of neoliberalism, which is really the assertion of the spontaneity of the system, in a world in which you had in the post decolonization phase, you actually had a certain degree of, I mean, like Keynesianism in Western Europe, certain degree of state intervention. The spontaneity of the system had been kept arrested. In this, when you have a reassertion of the spontaneity of the system, which happens, in my view, particularly with the introduction of neoliberal economic policies, inequalities have increased dramatically. You have absolute poverty has increased significantly in India during this period. And I would not be surprised, I'm not asserting this, but I would not be surprised if something similar also is happening in China. Therefore, it seems to me that overcoming alienation in the sense that I've been talking about requires not just socialism in the sense that you actually have state ownership of the means of production and so on. It requires the forming of a community. And you cannot form a community if you have vast inequalities within it, if you actually have growing absolute immiserization within it. And to ensure that that does not subvert the formation of a new community, it becomes essential then to ensure that commodity production does not intrude. And for that, the model of export-led growth, which, for instance, neoliberalism introduces, everybody has to then try and relate to a world market, and from the world market, then if you are successful, in that case, you can actually have a high growth rate, because of which you can improve the conditions of life of the ordinary workers and so on. All that I simply believe is not correct. And therefore, overcoming alienation, overcoming alienation is by no means easy, because it would require not just socialism in a formal sense where the state owns the means of production. It requires a certain different kind of society in which you have, let us say, production which is organized for the local market, production which is far more decentralized than simply a national level kind of planning board dictating you do this or you do that. So it would require a kind of genuine democratic decentralized production, and a production that does not necessarily seek to maximize the level of output or the level of the growth rate, in which the maintenance of the sense of community takes precedence over the so-called development of the productive forces. The last point I want to make is that there is, in Marxism, there is a certain view which I do not accept. I mean, in certain kinds of interpretation of Marxism, that basically that the development of the productive forces, capitalism is bad because it actually arrests the development of the productive forces at a certain time. Socialism is good because it carries the development of the productive forces beyond that, beyond, where capitalism arrests it, socialism carries it forward. I think that's a way of looking at capitalism and looking at socialism, which I don't agree with. I think basically the case for socialism arises because it is, to my mind, a necessary condition for the attainment of human freedom, not for a higher level of the development of the productive forces. So I'd like to look at the issue from a very different perspective. I think I better stop there. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your patience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Prabhat. Yeah, Professor Akeel, would you like to respond?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for asking me. It's a pleasure to speak with Prabhat, and thank you, Anaga, and Professor Housing for inviting me. Let me begin by slightly more abstract framework for developing the points that Prabhat presented from a more specifically economist's point of view. If you begin very abstractly, you notice that the term alienation is an incomplete idea, in just the way that, for instance, the term equality is an incomplete idea. You have to complete it. When you say equality, you have to say equality of what? So the question arises, every time you speak of equality, somebody can ask you equality of, and you have to complete the thought. So it's equality of outcome, equality of opportunity, equality of resources, and so on. Well, alienation is incomplete in that way, because you can't really get clear on what it means unless you ask alienation from what. And many different answers have been given to the question, what is alienation, alienation from? The most common is the one that Prabhat discussed in some detail, mostly through Marxist ideas, and that is alienation from each other, social alienation, though in Marx, of course, alienation from each other was deeply tied to the experience of a particular class, wage labor, and it was therefore caught up with alienation from one's work, alienation from the product of one's work, and so on. psychologists have very interestingly, and philosophers have talked about alienation from oneself. And not just from each other, but alienation from oneself. And in a way, I think alienation from each other is closely tied to alienation from oneself. And a very trivial example of alienation from oneself is, for instance, you will find it in the addict who doesn't want to be an addict. So suppose one is a drug addict or an alcoholic addict or addicted to cigarettes and so on. A part of one could say, I don't want to be an addict. So one is alienated from one's own desires. One's desire for a cigarette or for that fifth scotch or for some cocaine or whatever it might be, is one has those desires, but one part of one is alienated from it. One doesn't want to have those desires. So one can be alienated from oneself in that sense. One can have desires and one has other desires which are against having those first order desires. So that's alienation from oneself in a very broad sense. And then, of course, with the environmental crisis, people have talked about alienation from nature and so on. So the question alienation from can be completed in different ways. Focusing, as Prabhat did, on mostly social alienation, which I will try and link to alienation from oneself towards the end. The idea of alienation in that sense really was something that Marx was channeling from Hegel. And Hegel's idea of alienation was the idea that through history, human subjectivity and human reason finds itself detaching from the whole, from the social whole, in just the ways that Prabhat described in more material terms. And so you get the individual as detached from the social whole. This is basically a Hegelian idea. And it is part of the development, part of historical development, that one overcomes this detachment, and the evolution of historical evolution of Geist or spirit is that it is restored to a social whole, which of course in Hegel ended up being pretty much synonymous with the Prussian state. So Marx presents a materialist version of this individual detachment from the social whole, but that is the basic idea of alienation, first in Hegel and its more material formulation in Marx. I think Marx would have thought it utterly complacent of Hegel to think that alienation has been overcome in modernity. Marx's whole point was that modernity was dominated by capital, and it was an ideal for the future, a revolutionary future, and it would be quite wrong to think with Hegel that that we have overcome alienation in the modern period, at least so far. Now, and in that sense, I think Hegel, like Aristotle, was a rather complacent thinker. The thing I want to ask is slightly more abstract than what Prabhat was pursuing. What I want to ask is, what is it that one has to overcome when one overcomes alienation? Prabhat pointed out that in the end, you have to have a conception of socialism in which you transcend a certain very particular development which he finds defining of capitalism, and that is commodity production as Prabhat understands it. And that comes from a certain detachment that develops in political economy with, in particular, not just markets, but long-distance relationship that defines markets. Now, and that forces detachment because there's no engagement in the various links of the political economy. Now, what I want to ask is something slightly more abstract, and that is, when one says, as Prabhat repeatedly did, that it's the detachment of the individual, it's becoming more competitive because it's detached from the community or the social group, etc. What is it to overcome that detachment? What is it to have that detachment, and what is it to overcome it? I don't mean what are the mechanisms by which to overcome it, which is you overcome things like commodity production or capital defined along those lines. Those would be the institutional mechanisms that you have to transform in order to be unalienated. But what I want to ask is, what is it to be unalienated, quite apart from what brings it about in the what causal elements, what mechanisms bring it about? And Prabhat described that as a recovery of freedom. And that might be fine, but freedom is a very ambiguous term. There's the idea of negative freedom, which is you should not be interfered with, you should be, but that can't be the right thing we mean by freedom when we say that we have to recover freedom. I think what we have to recover is something more positive, what Isaiah Berlin called a more positive notion of freedom. And what that is what I want to explore. The way I've thought of it in some of my own writing follows some of the themes that Prabhat discussed, such as the enclosing of the commons, which gives rise to a certain kind of competitive individual detached from the community. One standard way of thinking about how one is joined with the community rather than detached, joined with a group. In a conjectural cultural anthropology, it has often been said that the first joining of individuals in a group takes the form of kinship ties. That is to say, when you had the commons, you can think of the commons as individuals living on the land, but the land is shared by the individuals, and they cultivate it, or they have, or if it's pastoral land, their cattle graze on it, or they simply, if it's forest land, they forage and sustain themselves on it. But so far, one can just think of it as individuals doing so. They share the land because there's no rivalry between them for the land, but they're just individuals, each sustaining themselves on the land. A real transformation of the commons happens when this idea of sharing is the idea of sharing as a group. So when the individuals in the commons begin to think of themselves as a group, the very idea of sharing means something different. You're not just individuals who are sharing some land, but living as individuals of it, you're conceiving yourself now as a group. So the very concept of sharing must mean something different. And what it brings to the forefront is the idea that we have to cooperate, we have to have relations of trust, and we have to have a kind of side-by-side living and all the things that that brings with it. So you can't detach the idea of the commons. Once you get a self-conception of yourself as a group, as individual inhabitants see themselves as a group, the idea of living in a shared, non-rivalrous relationship to the land is the idea that involves a whole complex set of relations of cooperation, trust, and tolerance, etc. So when cultural anthropologists say that the first sense of being seeing yourself as a group, what Prabhat was saying was being unalienated, joined with a community or a group, consisted in kinship ties. But kinship ties are naturalistic ties, they're blood ties. And at some point, even if that conjectural cultural anthropology is correct, that the first unalienated life of individuals seeing themselves as a group came with kinship ties, those ties, if they're naturalistic, if they're blood ties, we have come a long way from that. So pursuing this cultural anthropology, purely conjectural, by purely conjectural, I mean, political theorists do a lot of conjectural history. So the very idea of a social contract is part of a conjectural history. Nobody actually got together and made a contract, but you explain human social behavior by this theoretical term, which is the idea of a social contract, just like physicists explain physical phenomena by theoretical terms such as electrons and so on. So one conjectural anthropological move one might make is to say, well, how did we transcend the social ties that are kinship ties? We don't any longer think of the social in kinship terms, as just tied to family, just tied to blood relations. We think of it in broader, more general, wider terms. How did that transformation take place? By what agencies did new forms of joining with the group emerge over and above kinship? One way to think of it might go like this. And as I said, I'm doing conjectural cultural anthropology, just as political theorists do conjectural political history by talking about social contracts. So imagine, so I'm just making this up as a conjecture, imagine that you're in kinship relations, that's how you conceive of yourself as a group, and then there are conflicts within the kin. Conflicts arise. Now, you have to adjudicate the conflicts, resolve the conflicts. When you resolve conflicts, which are conflicts within kinship ties, you can't appeal to further kinship ties because both parts of the dispute, both parties to the dispute are kin, are tied by kinship or blood ties. So you can't appeal to further blood ties. You have to find a way of resolving the conflict by appeal, obviously, which goes beyond kinship ties, because both parties to the dispute are tied by kinship. So you need this kind of bootstrapping by which you transcend kinship relations. And that happens when there are conflicts within kinship relations, which you can only resolve by appeal to something which goes beyond kinship, general principles of some kind. And these could take many forms. They would take abstract forms. You would have to say, well, this is a relevant similarity, this is an irrelevant similarity, you have to treat like cases alike, and you come up with these principles, which eventually lead to principles that political theorists call fairness, justice, and so on. These are criteria that evolve over time to these conflict resolution principles. But the idea is that you have to climb out of kinship only because there are conflicts within kinship, and kinship ties won't help you to resolve the conflict. That's a very Hegelian idea. You get conflict and you have to make a resolution by going to a further set of principles. It's the evolution of reason in Hegel. What I want to emphasize is that these principles, whatever they may be, today we call them justice and fairness and so on, political theorists use that vocabulary, but whatever these principles are, whatever these norms are, whatever the laws are, they come from something which is much less discursive, which is much less articulated. They come from everyday quotidian relations, which are unself-conscious, implicit, unspoken, relations of trust and cooperation between people. And you couldn't have conflict adjudicating laws and norms and so on unless you could take for granted that these non-discursive relations exist between people. That is, when we always have to have a background of implicit, unspoken habits. They're literally customs and habits. Customs and habits is a term from Hume, taken over from Burke and Hume. And it's what Wittgenstein called forms of life. And these non-discursive relations amongst people make possible a certain form of norm, law, and things that we are made to follow, either by sanctions that are formal, such as punishment, or by attitudes of blame and social pressure and shame, things like that. So here's what I think is a very important thing to understand, and that is when one talks of alienation, one is not in the realm, when one talks of being unalienated, one is not in the realm of law. You can't say, I'm going to by law, force you to be unalienated. That's to misunderstand the very nature of being unalienated. You can't dictate unalienation. Unalienation has to happen by, it's in the nature of unalienatedness that it doesn't appear to be an ideal. It doesn't take the form of a discursive law or norm. Right? It's a set of human relations which doesn't take an articulated form. I want to get this I want to bring out this point, which I think is the deepest point about alienation in a way, and that is when unalienatedness, when we have overcome alienation, when we are unalienated, of course, being unalienated is an ideal, but when it's working, it doesn't appear as an ideal. That's, I think, a very deep and significant thing about the idea of alienation, that when it is actually working, it is not explicit as an ideal. You can't say that of liberty. Liberty is in constitutions. It's there as a right. Right? But I'm saying it's in the nature of alienation that it cannot have that explicit form. It's in the nature of being unalienated that it cannot take that form. It doesn't appear to be an ideal when it's working. And I want to bring this philosophical point about it out by giving you an analogy with something that Wittgenstein spoke about. And I think until you see the point of this analogy, you won't really see what it is that Prabhat had in mind when he said that you're not detached from the community. So I'd like to spend the last few minutes of this talk to try and spell out what it means philosophically to be joined with the community and not detached from it in terms of a way of thinking, a form of life, as Wittgenstein said. So I'm going to share the screen to spell this out a little. Who's the host? Anaga, are you the host?
Yes,
You've disabled screen sharing. Yeah. Can you enable me to have it?
Yes, you're now enabled.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is it working now?
Yes. Can you see this? Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Why is that? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now can you see it?
Yes, we can see your screen.
All right. So I'm going to spell out for you an idea in Wittgenstein. And can you see the screen? Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, Professor. I think everybody can.
Yeah, Akeel, we can. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. All right. That's all right.
All right. I can make it larger actually. Let me try. All right. This surely you can. Okay. So I'm going to define the idea of a basic action. It's an idea that Wittgenstein spells out when he's talking about human states of mind and intentionalities. And the idea of a basic action is you do X, any action X, and you do nothing else, Y or Z, in virtue of which you do X. Right? So when something is a basic action, you do it, but there's nothing else you do in virtue of which you do X. X is basic, right? It isn't an outcome. It isn't a set of accretions to other things you do. So here's an example that he gives. Suppose you're waving to a friend. He says, many philosophers mistakenly think that the waving to a friend consists of more basic things like moving your arm. Right? So so it goes like this. He says, people think that the basic thing is that there's an arm movement. Then you have an intention You add an intention, that's an accretion. You add to the arm movement an accretion, and you get moving your arm. And then you add to that a further accretion, intention to wave to a friend, and then you get the action waving to a friend. So the most basic thing is your arm movement. An intention to move your arm is attached, accretes to it. That gives you this action. And then a further intention attaches to this action, and then you get this action. And Wittgenstein says, no. You can't reduce intentionality to these other things. There's nothing more basic. This is basic. Waving to a friend, full stop. There's nothing more basic than that. It's the essence of having a human mind, making decisions, acting, etc., that this is basic. Now, when this is working, when individual intentionality is working, this does not seem like an ideal. Right? You just wave to a friend, but it is an ideal. And it only comes out when it's not working. So let me explain. Suppose Prabhat and I have become estranged, alienated. We've had some kind of quarrel. We've suddenly become self-conscious. Now, we're trying to make up. We're trying to put the quarrel behind us, trying to overcome our estrangement. Okay? But we've been made self-conscious by the estrangement. We don't have the same relations anymore. We're trying to overcome the estrangement, but so what I do here doesn't have the same unself-conscious thing because we've become estranged. Right? So I then say, so my thinking goes, well, let me try. Wait, I can't do it with the same unself-conscious flamboyance or nonchalance or jauntiness. I'm all self-conscious because of the estrangement. So I then say, let me try. Let me move my arm. And let's hope that it comes off as a waving which is friendly. Right? So it isn't a waving to a friend. It's a moving of my arm, plus I hope that it'll have the effect that it has. This happens when you're estranged. You said, let me try this, and I hope it'll have the effect. But if there is no estrangement, right, then when things are working, I'm only waving to a friend. It's only when things are not working that something else is more basic, and I just hope that it becomes a friendly waving. That's what's individual, that's what the alienation is like. That is, when we get detached from each other, then alienation seems like an ideal. But when it's working, it's just like waving to a friend. You don't think of it as an ideal. It's just basic. And one way to bring this out is to go back to what Prabhat was saying about the commons. The way I've tried to present it in the case of alienation is that a standard way of thinking about why you can't have unalienated collective group where the individuals join with the group, why you can't have that in the commons is because there is a prospect, a specter of the tragedy of the commons that's always present. And this is what capital introduces into the idea of the commons. That is, the idea of collective cultivation of the commons is said to be an incoherent idea because rationality requires us to not cooperate in the unself-conscious way that non-alienatedness requires. And the argument is a game theoretic argument. It's a multi-person prisoner's dilemma. And the way it goes, the standard understanding of it is that if you're going to be an unalienated group, you have to have relations of trust and cooperation. But it's not rational to cooperate. Because if I cooperate and you don't, that'll be the worst possible thing for me. And I don't know that you will cooperate. That's what a multi-person prisoner's dilemma says. So the idea is that we are all in a commons, and we can only be a collective unalienated group in it if each one of us pays the cost of cooperation. The cost of cooperation could be anything. It could mean not overfishing, not overgrazing, not over-cultivating, etc., right? Not doing more than what you should be doing. And if everybody cooperates, of course, everybody gains. That's the unalienated ideal. But according to this way of thinking, which leads to the tragedy of the commons, each commoner is anxious. What if I cooperated and others don't? That's the worst possible outcome for me. What if I pay the cost of cooperation? I hold back my cattle, etc., from grazing too much, but others don't. Well, that'll be terrible for me. So it's rational for me to not pay the cost of cooperation. And if everybody thinks that way, the commons are destroyed. That's the tragedy. Right? So the anxiety, what if I cooperated and others didn't, right, drives you to say it's more rational not to cooperate. But that gives rise to the tragedy, because if everybody thinks like that, the commons are doomed, right? They'll be overgrazing or over-cultivating or whatever. So the idea that lies behind the first incipient capital move in capital is, therefore, privatize the land. It's more rational to do that, given these anxieties, than to cooperate. Actually, the dominance argument is even stronger in the multi-person game, but this is the basic idea. And I'm saying that what is really meant by unalienatedness, what Prabhat was saying, when one is not detached from the group, one is not competitive, etc. What one is really saying is that the qualm, the anxiety, what if I cooperated and others didn't, never occurs to one. If it occurs to one, one is alienated. So if you want a one-sentence definition of what it is to be unalienated, what it is to not be detached from the group, the answer is you're unalienated if that thought never occurs to you. The thought, what if I cooperated and others didn't? it doesn't occur to you. So I don't exactly think that it is feelings of solidarity with the trade union or anything like that. Because then unalienatedness would be no different from fraternity. But I don't think fraternity and unalienatedness are the same thing. It's not a critique of self-interest. Right? It's not a critique of self-interest. It's not asking you to have solidarity or anything like that. It's saying a certain way of thinking does not occur to you. Right? Just like when you're unself-conscious, you just wave to a friend. You don't say, let me try moving my arm and maybe it'll come across as a friendly wave. You don't do that. You just wave. It's only when you're estranged that you do something else. Right? And what I'm saying is that this thinking that we are doomed to a tragedy, so we better privatize and all, only comes when you are self-conscious in the wrong way. But if you're unself-conscious, the thought never occurs to you, what if I cooperated and others didn't? That's what it is to be unalienated. And the point is that in our everyday unself-conscious lives, we are very often unalienated. But very often in our public collective lives, we find ourselves alienated. And the real issue is, how do we scale up those frames we're in when we're unalienated to the more public frames of alienation? And Marx gave one answer to it. Prabhat's understanding of it is that you have to overcome commodity production. No doubt others have given other answers to it. But what I'm trying to capture is if you like, the phenomenology of unalienatedness, which is that if you're really attached to the group, the thought never occurs to you. And so if it's working as an ideal, the ideal doesn't have to be articulated. Right? It isn't like other ideals like liberty, where you state it explicitly as a right, as a law, etc. No, it is not in the realm of law. It's in the realm of discretion, of habit, of the habits of democracy, not the principles and laws of democracy, the habits of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Akeel, for this very provocative and insightful presentation. May I now request Professor Sanjay to take over and be the discussant to the two presentations. Professor Sanjay, over to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I may have to close the video because otherwise the mic doesn't cooperate. So my apologies for that. Okay. Now, it's not going to be easy to give a quick response to these two very felicitous presentations. And what I'm going to do is to partly respond to the points made by both Professor Patnaik and Professor Biilgrami, but also try and take the discussion in a slightly different direction. I'll still, I think, be talking about issues that concern both of them, but probably not in a manner which would meet with their approval. Now, of the two concepts, that is the concept of alienation and the concept of freedom, as you know, is more protean. It has been deployed for a variety of political ideological purposes and sometimes with startling consequences. While alienation...
Can I just interrupt you for a minute? You know, My speaker system is very scratchy here. I'm not able to follow what you're saying. It may be helpful to actually see you, because if one can look at you and read your lips a little too, it'd be much easier to follow for me. I'm actually not able to follow what you're saying without seeing you speak.
Okay, let me try.
No.
Is it any better now?
Much better, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So as I was saying, of the two concepts, that is the concept of alienation and the concept of freedom, the concept of freedom, as we know, is more protean. It's been used for a variety of political and ideological purposes, sometimes with startling consequences. Whereas the concept of alienation has had a more distinct history and a distinct sense. And that sense is the sense of a specific kind of loss. So I think what the concept of alienation does is that it enables us to tell a story of loss and recovery. Now, the temporality involved in this story of loss and recovery is, of course, a fairly special kind of temporality, because what is recovered is usually richer and more complex than what was lost. And that is very something which is spatially Hegelian about the use of the concept of alienation. Now, in Marx, alienation and freedom have a very strong conceptual connection. And that connection is very briefly as follows. It is the historically transient conditions of unfreedom that turn material activity from being an expressive activity to being an estranging activity, which in turn reproduces conditions of unfreedom. Freedom in this context is a recovery of lost collective control over our own material forces, which have assumed a certain autonomy. Now, this is the sense which comes across very clearly in Marx's concept of commodity fetishism, but also several other works, particularly parts of Grundrisse. Now, outside this theoretical context, and this is one of the first questions that I want to raise, outside this very specific Marxian theoretical context, would the connection between alienation and freedom be as compelling as it seems to be in Marx? What would alienation mean? And one answer to this question has already been presented by Professor Biilgrami. What would alienation mean if we were to expand the notion of material activity beyond its sense in Marx as production, whether production taken in a literal sense or production taken in its metaphorical sense? So if we were to expand the notion of materiality, as I think we should, beyond this sense that it has in classical Marxism, what would alienation then mean? And as I said, Professor Biilgrami has presented one answer to that question. Now, this is where I would like to bring in Gandhi. Professor Biilgrami has spoken and written on this on a variety of occasions at a variety of places. So to what extent and in what ways would Gandhi be relevant in thinking about alienation and freedom? It's obvious, of course, that it is the thought behind a completely different vocabulary, a completely different terminology, which is what we are trying to recover for the purposes of this evening. Now, words or terms like violence and non-violence are probably on every page of Gandhi's collected works. Behind Gandhi's obsession with violence and non-violence, can we see a ceaseless attempt to discover our essential connectedness? Violence not only in physical sense, but violence in the sense of something being violative of that essential connectedness. Professor Biilgrami has on a number of occasions spoken about the idea of an exemplar. And I want to explore that very, very quickly, very, very briefly. Isn't being an exemplar and letting one's courage or letting one's mode of life, letting one's actions, letting one's simplicity spontaneously create effects in the world around us? Isn't in this a supreme example of renewing our connectedness? And is it also not a daring attempt to bet on something which primarily our connectedness, which has apparently faded or weakened or disappeared from our collective lives? But there is something more to this, and this is where I think we need to, in order to think about alienation and freedom, we probably need to go beyond a certain philosophy of history, because what the idea of an exemplar tells us is that there is this daring attempt to explore strength and beauty in our finiteness. What kind of sense of time a person or persons exploring their finiteness and exploring strength in their being limited creatures and yet connected creatures, what kind of sense of time would such persons have? And would their concept of politics or political action not be qualitatively different from what it is for those who happen to have a certain sense of time, which comes to them from a certain philosophy of history? These are, I think, some of the questions which have partly been flagged, partly been answered, but partly also questions which occurred to me while listening to Professor Biilgrami and Professor Patnaik. So I think it is a certain sense of time which is indescribable, which is theoretically difficult, hard to define, except as Professor Biilgrami tried to do in a phenomenological way, which is what I think appears on the horizon of one's imagination when one starts exploring one's finiteness. I think freedom, therefore, is less of a less important concept in this mode of thinking than the belief that it is through exploring our finiteness, our limitedness, that we can connect ourselves to not only to others, but to that which is beyond the finite. This is a qualitatively different way of thinking, and it is this completely different dimension of thinking which I think we need to bring in this evening's discussion of alienation and freedom, along with, as I said, several other critical concerns of the contemporary world, namely a completely new thinking about our various materialities. As long as materiality is understood only in the literal or metaphoric sense of production, there would be only one temporality, whereas once you start thinking of different materialities, there would be different temporalities, and therefore our sense of time would be completely different. These are the thoughts which occur to me. while listening to very, very stimulating presentations by the two speakers of the evening. So this is all from my side. Back to the chair.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sanjay, for this. Uh, would Professor Biilgrami or Professor Patnaik briefly like to respond to the point raised by Professor Sanjay, or in response to the presentation made earlier by each one of you? Professor Biilgrami, would you like to briefly intersect? And we would also request Professor Patnaik to briefly respond to what Professor Biilgrami presented, maybe in around 5 to 7 minutes. Then we'll open the floor for question and answer session.
I would like to come right at the end after the questions have been raised by others, because that will probably leave more time. But Akeel can respond.
Yeah, Professor Biilgrami, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah, please unmute. Yeah.
Okay, so I've already addressed some of Prabhat's remarks. So let me say a few things briefly about the extremely interesting remarks by Professor Palchika. I agree with you, Professor Palchika, that the recovery of an unalienated life is bound to be different, very different from, and very much richer, or at any rate, rather different from what was lost with alienation. Now, one of the things that is presupposed by the way you put your point is that this talk of recovery and so on is everybody, every significant person who's written on alienation agrees that it's a modern malaise, that it's a malaise of modernity. And Prabhat's talk took that for granted as well. So what that means is that there is a sense in which pre-modern social life was unalienated. I think that's captured in our instinctive understanding of the fact that even serfs and even slaves, whatever horrible oppressions they lived through, they had a sense of belonging. So however horribly defective pre-modern societies were, because we want to intuitively say that however much they suffered in other ways, they didn't suffer from a lack of belonging to the society, that not even slaves and serfs, that was alienation was not a mark of pre-modern lives. Well, however, we know for a fact that the defects of pre-modern societies were precisely the defects that one tried to overcome in modernity by articulating remarkable principles like equality and liberty and so on. So what we have to try and understand is how, if we are going to recover a sense of belonging in the modern period after it was lost, it will have to nest within liberty and equality, right? It won't be pre-modern unalienatedness, which existed without liberty and equality. So the recovery will be richer in that we now have a triangular relation between liberty, equality, and unalienatedness, which transforms each of the notions, liberty, equality, and unalienatedness. Because unalienated is now nesting within things which are modern and new, like liberty and equality, which they didn't exist in the past. So I completely agree with you that it would have to be much richer when it is recovered, and this is one way to pursue the sense in which it would be richer, that it nests with concepts of modernity like liberty and equality, thereby transforming liberty and equality, which mostly until now have existed, as Prabhat was pointing out, in the presence of a very unalienated social set of social relations. Okay. You made some really very fascinating remarks about exemplarity and how that has faded and how that might be related. And I think that's absolutely right. You see, what I was struggling to say, and I'm sorry if I was not as clear as I would have liked to have been about it, see, what I really want to try and convey is that we have, in modern societies and polities, we have articulated constitutions, laws, codes, which are perfectly explicit, and they're discursive, they are propositional, they are, in a sense, sanctioned commandments, right? Sanctioned by the state and its institutions, and liberty, of course, is very much part of them. Equality is sometimes articulated, almost never implemented, but it is very much part of the articulations of modernity. What I want to claim is that nothing in the realm of law, nothing in the realm of explicit norms and normativity is possible without non-discursive, implicit relations between people. Look, let me put it this way. Let's just take an example, just to make things vivid. I'm sorry, this might seem like a vulgar example, but it's an example that surfaced recently. So campuses said there should be no obscenities. Some campuses, there should be no obscenities articulated in public. Right? This was put down as an explicit norm. Do you know what students did on a campus? They said, okay, we'll stick to the letter of the law, but we will. So they wore T-shirts. 4 students wore T-shirts. One of them said F, the next one said U, the next one said C, the next one said K, and they sat in a row together. Right? Completely, they said, who are you going to blame? This is not a violation of any law. We're just wearing a T-shirt. And we said, no, we haven't said anything. Right? And said, no, it's an obscene word. So they said, okay, so we'll scatter ourselves a little bit. The next day they came and they sat slightly differently from each other, and you'd have to strain. See, you can say anything in the law, but if people don't want to cooperate, they will not cooperate. They will loophole the law. They will bribe policemen. They will threaten witnesses who cooperate with policing and the law. You need a whole range of unspoken willingness of trust and cooperation if the law is going to work. Sorry, it seems as I've lost. Can you see me?
Yeah, you're all right. Yeah, you're doing fine. Yeah,
All right.
We can see you, Professor Biilgrami.
So what I'm saying is, no implementation of law, not even no articulation of law would be possible unless there were non-discursive relations between people that were matter of the habits. You just have to have a whole range of habits of cooperation and so on, and otherwise the law doesn't work. So what I'm trying to point out is that something like exemplarity is part of the unspoken side of the law. It's this underlying, it's the background. It's what Heidegger would call the background. It's what Nietzsche called the Dionysian to the Apollonian. The Apollonian is the representational, the Dionysian is the expressive. So a number of different, Wittgenstein says no rules are possible unless they're forms of life in the background. So I'm appealing to all these things, what Heidegger called the background, what Nietzsche called the Dionysian possibilities that make possible the Apollonian, what Wittgenstein called forms of life that make possible rules and of speech and language and so on. And exemplarity, I think, is very much part of the background. So you just follow somebody's examples. You see a man of virtue or a woman of virtue, and you follow the example. You don't need to articulate any principles or laws of that kind. So I don't believe that you see, it's a very, very interesting thing to me that Foucault got very anxious. What was he anxious about? The disciplinarity of Enlightenment penality. He says there's something about Enlightenment penality which made Foucault very anxious. He said, we've come to a new episteme in which, penality has got this new disciplinarity. What was he really anxious about? Now, I don't think that Foucault had it right. I think but part of the reason his anxiety was what I'm calling the foreground of law, explicit articulation. Foucault's anxiety really deep down was this foreground of law, etc., is being taken to be all of the ground. The explicit foreground of law, etc., is taking over the whole ground, but it's only the foreground. There's a whole lot of background of discretion, of exemplarity rather than principles, and which allow for the articulation and implementation of the foreground. The foreground doesn't take over everything. If you did, you would have Foucauldian disciplinarity, which is oppressive. And if you look at what Bishop Tutu and Mandela tried to do in transitional justice in the South African period, what they were saying was, look, we've got to live side by side with these people who oppressed us in the past. We should not treat them we should not subject them to forensic treatment of objective law in the way that as if they were all criminals. What we have to do is engage with them in this non-discursive way, draw them out through engagement and let the truth emerge about the past through this, and maybe corrections will be made through that. They called it healing, not punishment. Right? So what they were basically trying to do was to say, look, this is such a remarkable moment in South Africa. We should just simply give up on the foreground and bring the background into the foreground. That's the only way we will be able to live with the past in the future, because we have to live with these people. We're not going to incarcerate everybody. We've got to live with them. Right? So that was precisely a return to the background as significant and brought into the foreground. And this is a very remarkable moment. It was quite a unique moment. Whether it succeeded or not, its purpose was remarkable. So in that sense, I think your point about exemplarity is that it hasn't faded. It's there, but it's in the background. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Biilgrami, for that response. We have the first question of the day. May I request the audience to post their question in the chat box, please, so that we can take maybe 2 or 3 rounds of questions and lump them together in ways which should be convenient for both the speakers to respond. And as I raise this question to both the speakers, may I also request the audience to post the question in the chat box. And this is a question from Partha Banerjee. Thank you, Partha, for this question. And the question is, what is the role of virtuality for increasing inequality? That virtuality based on knowledge of individual same kind of information to two different individuals may have different knowledge due to the difference of their growing up of conscience. Professor Biilgrami, would you like to take this question first, or Professor Patnaik? I think since the question is not pointed to any specific speaker, one of you might like to take this up. It's in the chat box if you want to have a look at.
Virtuality. I mean, I'm not going to pretend I understand what is meant by virtuality.
Partha, if you are around, can you spell out for the speaker so that it would be intelligible to them? Partha?
Are you talking by virtuality? You mean not non-face-to-face relations, relations through digital media? I don't understand. What is meant by virtuality?
Partha, are you around? Can you spell that out for Professor Biilgrami? What you mean by virtuality? Yeah, Tarun, please ask your question and please make it pointed and specific. Tarun? Please unmute and speak, or post your question in the chat box.
Well, there's a question for Professor Patnaik.
Yeah, there is a question for how does neoliberalism reinforce the spontaneity of the capitalist system? Isn't the fact that there exists different manners in which the capitalist system can be reinforced indicative of the system's ability to change, which in turn may become detrimental to its spontaneity? Professor Patnaik, would you like to address this question?
Well, the way I see it is that in the post-war period, in the West, as well as in the post-decolonized countries of the South, you actually had an interference with capitalist spontaneity. In the West, you actually had the so-called welfare capitalism. You had Keynesian demand management, which believed that you could provide employment to everybody who wants to work. You can have full employment, etc. Now, you didn't actually provide full employment, but you did have substantial state intervention, not only in favor of the capitalists. You had substantial state intervention in favor of the common people, in favor of the workers, in order to build a welfare state. Now, the point is that by spontaneity, what I mean is that that meant an interference with the immanent tendencies of capital. That, for instance, if you have wealth taxation, substantial wealth taxation, then that is something which is interfering with the spontaneous tendency of capital to generate inequality, to generate greater concentration, and so on. State intervention, even fiscal intervention, can be a means of checking the spontaneous tendencies, the immanent tendencies of capital. Now, but those are precisely the ones that actually made the system dysfunctional. Very high levels of employment actually gave rise to strong trade unions, and strong trade unions demanded higher wages. Higher wages, the demand for higher wages gave rise to inflation, and so on. And inflation brought in turn to power people like Margaret Thatcher, who then wanted to smash the trade unions. In other words, the immanence of the immanent tendencies of capital were kind of established, not fully, but I'm talking about tendencies, were established through the intervention of the state because there was a specific dysfunctionality associated with the operation of welfare capitalism. And it is in that sense that you now have, I mean, obviously, because capitalism would like a labor market in which all the laborers simply come as individuals. Any trade union represents an interference with the immanent tendency of capital. Now, up to a point, capitalism can actually accept it. But beyond a point, you actually find that it tends to roll back the unions, which is the sort of thing that has happened. Look at the global south, look at our own country. You actually had a state that, in a sense, appeared to be above classes presiding over everybody's interests and so on. It may be protective of bourgeois property, but on the other hand, the state also intervened to make sure that the farmers got kind of fair prices, the farmers got minimum support price, procurement price, and so on. You had labor laws, for instance, that actually protected the working class against, arbitrary dismissals and so on. But on the other hand, with neoliberalism, now, once more, you have this tendency towards the spontaneity of capitalism establishing itself. And what is, for instance, the whole farmers outside Delhi protesting? What they are protesting is against corporate encroachment on peasant agriculture. But corporate encroachment on petty production is a law of capitalism. So that the immanent tendency of capitalism, which had been kept in abeyance in the earlier period, is now sought to be re-established. And that's what the petty producers are protesting against, the peasant agriculture being an example. Similarly, the labor laws which are being passed, the labor codes and so on, they're basically introducing the right to hire and fire. And the right to hire and fire goes against something which the workers had actually fought and won and was sanctified by the state in India as early as the 1950s. So all kinds of interference to make capitalism more humane are being sought to be rolled back. And that's what I mean by saying that there is an attempt at re-establishing the spontaneity. Akeel, question for you.
Yeah. Yes, so this last question of Tarun Gidwani has come up with the question that he had promised to come up with. About the relationship between freedom and, you see, I think it's the question Prabhat has raised about the relationship between, Prabhat virtually equates freedom with unalienatedness, because he says that what happens in capitalism is that because of these spontaneous tendencies, every subject, every agent is just doing what is demanded of them by just being caught up in the framework of capitalism, right? So even the capitalist class is alienated because they can't help doing it. They are in this, whatever it might be, the Darwinian jungle of competitiveness and so on. So everybody, both of all classes, are involved with alienation. Now, I think that's a very significant point, partly because, I mean, I think that has to be right. What Prabhat says, that all classes are affected by alienation in capitalist societies, is a very important point, partly because you've got to motivate for all classes that the socialist society, the socialist alternative is better, right? And so you have to find all classes, in some sense, are worse off as a result of these developments in capitalism. So that is why Gandhi, for instance, said explicitly, nobody's well off if somebody's badly off. And that means that in one sense, even the well-off in the material sense are badly off because they're alienated. Right? That's really what Gandhi was saying. Now, however, where I don't understand, where I'm not sure I agree with Prabhat is, you see, if you tell somebody who is in a privileged position in a capitalist society, if you tell somebody you are not free, right, they'll say, yes, we are free. To take Prabhat's own example, we are free. We want to go to the museum. We're going to the museum. We want to go for a long walk. We go for a long walk. We want to sit and listen to Kishoriya Monkar. We're sitting and listening to Kishoriya Monkar. Right? So what is this? You're telling us you're not free. So obviously, what Prabhat has in mind is freedom in a different sense, right? That you're nevertheless, you are personified along the lines that capital personifies you in some more abstract sense than this quotidian everyday notion of freedom, right? Now, what I want to say is that may be so, but when you are that, you don't experience alienation. You see, you can't define alienation so that the experience of it is not vivid. And that's why I don't think you can equate alienation with the kind of unfreedom that Prabhat is talking about, right? Because this highly abstract idea of you're doing the bidding of your personified role in a capitalist framework doesn't capture the phenomenology of alienation. It's too abstract for that. And so it's to capture the phenomenology that I brought in this idea of how you have anxieties, right? What if I cooperated and others didn't? What if see, those are real felt, phenomenologically significant states of mind. It's a mentality. And that, I believe, is something which is important to stress. And it's not synonymous with this abstract ideal of freedom. It's a much more concretely experienced idea of, because it's a little bit like saying, I feel, when an addict says, I hate myself for wanting that drug or wanting that umpteenth drink I'm having or that cigarette I'm having. I don't like myself when I do that. Well, that's a way of thinking. And I'm saying when you're alienated, you often feel that way. You actually feel, you're anxious. You say, what if I did it and others didn't? And these are things to be overcome. But once they're overcome, they don't seem, it isn't as if you're following a law and you'd be punished if you don't do it. It just happens in ways that are completely non-discursive and unself-conscious. The ideal, when it's working, doesn't appear as an ideal. So it's just experience. As I said, waving to a friend, you just experience the friendliness of doing it. You're not anxious. You don't try something else and hope that it'll happen. You just experience friendship. Right? It's just part of your way of life. And I think as a result of that, you've got to see these two things as though related. They're different. You can't equate unalienatedness with freedom. That's my instinct anyway.
Am I audible? I seem to have lost the link. Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes.
you're audible, very much audible. Yeah, you're fine.
I'm not visible, I suppose. Just two points I want to make. One is a very important question was raised to me, on this question of village community. That if I am talking about eschewing commodity production, then do I visualize, like Gandhi, a sort of restoration of the village community? Well, I do visualize a restoration of the community, whether it's village or commune or whether the whole country can actually function like one village community. In other words, I would not insist on the village as such being the unit. And secondly, I agree with Akeel that this community, this connectedness would itself have to be nested within liberty and equality, unlike earlier, the so-called unchanging village community that Baden-Powell had written about and Marx took on from. Was one which was really characterized by the caste system, by incredible oppression inside that community. I mean, it was a community to which you were born. It was not a community that you formed. So the point is that, you know, that it has to be nested differently within the concepts of liberty and equality, and it need not be a village community, but some notion of a community. And the point really I would like to emphasize that that notion of a community gets subverted by competition, and certainly gets subverted by the kind of growth strategy that kind of prioritizes GDP growth and prioritizes exports and so on, prioritizes world trade as a means of, experiencing high GDP growth. And mind you, this is something which is also accepted by many on the left, saying that, you know, I mean, within the world as a whole, we ought to have greater cooperation, I mean, you know, greater international specialization and such like things. And that, I think, is one which appears on the surface very reasonable, but is actually in a very deep sense subversive of any notion of connectedness or unalienated life. The other point in passing I want to make, you know, that to Akeel, is that, you know, this notion of the tragedy of the commons. You see, when you say that, what should I cooperate or should I not cooperate? Already, in a sense, you are making individual profit and loss calculations, which in fact arise only under capitalism or under commodity production that leads up to capitalism. So you are actually talking about a tragedy of commons by and thereby justifying the creation of private property by already assuming that everybody who partakes of the commons is having a bourgeois attitude. So you presume a bourgeois attitude and you justify private property on the basis of that, which is a very, you know, which is a very circular reasoning to my mind. That's all I have to say.
Professor Biilgrami, there is a related question on this by Professor Chaitani of MS Baroda University. Do I need to read out for you, or would you please look at the question by Professor Laswanti Chaitani? Yeah.
Okay, I see.
While you talk about the prisoner's dilemma in terms of one not cooperating thus in case others do not, and this in turn leading to the tragedy of the commons, how do you explain Gandhi's non-cooperation as facilitating a form of commons, if you like, a public, which was based on a practice or politics of non-cooperation? Also, how would you read Gandhian non-cooperation in terms of its relationship with alienation and freedom? That's the question.
Right. So I think the idea of non-cooperation in Gandhi is really a tactic, a long-term tactic, if you like, a strategy, to oppose a certain economic conditions that were imposed on colonized people, and also political conditions that were. I think that that form of non-cooperation is non-cooperation with a government or a state, imperial state, and its policies. Whereas the notion of non-cooperation that is being discussed in the context of the commons is of commoners who have, in a sense, not really even as yet, it's not obvious that they are targeting any state right? They're basically targeting each other. And as Prabhat just pointed out, that they're targeting each other because they're already in a bourgeois way of thinking, or what I was calling an unalienated way of thinking. That was partly my point too, that you're already alienated if you ask that question. So now, so I think that the idea of non-cooperation, it's sort of an, it's like a bad pun if you, because one is targeting the state in Gandhi's case, and in the other case, it's the set of relations between commoners with no particular state as its target. The important thing, Lajwanti, is to get the fact that, I mean, I think Prabhat is absolutely right that it's assuming a bourgeois way of thinking, but then the question arises: how is it that one characterizes what it is to not have that thinking? Right? That's the question I'd set myself. What is it to not have that, what Prabhat calls a bourgeois way of thinking, and I'm calling the alienated way of thinking, right? What is it to not have that? Right? And I'm saying that it's to not have that anxiety arise at all. But my point is that it's wrong to think of capitalism. This is really, I mean, I'd be very curious to know what Prabhat has to say about it, because I don't think, like Foucault did, that, or maybe Marx, but this is I think it's open to how to interpret Marx. I don't think that you have an era in which you have completely got rid of any kind of unalienated set of social relations in capitalism. Or as Foucault says, with the Enlightenment, you've gotten rid of all discretion, exemplarity, everything else. It's all just draconian penalty, law. You've got, that everything is to be determined by sanction, law, etc. Right? Everything is disciplined. I don't believe see, I don't think modernity is comprehensive. Modernity is not comprehensive. The effects of modernity, that is not comprehensive. I never ask the question, what if I cooperated and others didn't? When I'm thinking about my daughter, it never occurs to me to say, what if I cooperated in household chores and my daughter didn't? There are many contexts in which I don't. Gandhi said, everywhere in ashram life, nobody in the ashram is anxious in these ways. He says, come to my ashram. Nobody's anxious in these ways. And in many contexts, we are completely unalienated. The idea that we have been totally taken over by an alienated set of social relations is simply false. Modernity's reach, cognitive reach, is simply not comprehensive in that way. So in many contexts, you and I and every one of us is completely unalienated. We go in and out of alienation in different frames. We think in a very alienated way. In one frame, we think in an alienated way. In another frame, we don't think, we think of in a completely unalienated way. We don't even know we're being inconsistent because we're thinking in different frames. We don't even know that these are ways of being that are completely inconsistent, because when you're in a frame, it's insulated. You don't have logical relations straddling frames, right? So one of the goals of politics, and it was indeed one of Gandhi's goals, was to try and make people realize that they are contradicting each other. You remove the boundaries between the frames so that what you refuse to be with your daughter, you bring to a more public and collective level too. You try and learn from some context to go to other contexts. You don't insulate those things into different frames. And part of the goal of politics is to make you realize your inconsistencies and overcome them, to scale up the moments and the contexts in which you're unalienated to other contexts, where you're making policies, where you and so on. And so, so I think those are that was what I was trying to capture by saying they are unalienated sets of social relations which are there by habit, by custom, by quotidian everyday practice. And if it wasn't there, no law which would police non-cooperation would even succeed. Look, let me give you an example. My wife is invited to go to jury duty. All citizens of, I'm not a citizen of the United States, I'm still an Indian citizen, but she's invited to go to jury duty. She's asked to go to jury duty, and it's required by law that you go to jury duty every now and then as a citizen. It's almost impossible to implement. If somebody wants to avoid jury duty, they can just do it. They can just make up an excuse. They can say, I'm not well. There are any number of ways to avoid cooperating with the law. She goes. She never turns it down. People do the honest thing. They do the trustworthy thing. They cooperate. If you, many laws can't be implemented because you can't even detect non-cooperation with the law. And you know, though you can bribe and threaten and so on, most people don't. The point is, as I said, in many contexts, we are unalienated. And if that is right, the issue is, how do we scale that up? How do we make it apply to the thinking we have in one context, apply to others when we are alienated? That's a goal of politics that has not been theorized sufficiently. And I think it's perfectly possible, as Prabhat is saying, that you may not be able to scale it up unless you really overcome deep economic issues about commodity production and so on and so forth. Right? But that's a matter of which mechanism makes possible certain ways of thinking. And I think it's perfectly possible that he's right in saying that unless you overcome some of these economic frameworks which we are stuck in, of commodity framework, giving rise to ideas of growth, export-based growth, and so all these things, you may have to struggle against all that in order to make the scaling up possible. So it's not as if I'm disagreeing with Prabhat at all. I'm just saying that these are the ways to actually spell out what is needed and bring it together with what institutional and so on things make it possible.
You know, there is a standard argument which is put forward against the very conception of socialism, which in a sense recaptures the tragedy of the commons argument. And this says that you cannot, I mean, you know, there is a problem of incentive compatibility, you know, that if you have to provide incentives to everybody, then there would be a conflict of interest that would actually subvert socialism. Now, the problem with that is that you're actually assuming a bourgeois attitude on the part of everyone in a socialist society, and then arguing the impossibility of socialism on the basis of that. Now, you see, people are not people who put forward this argument. They do not see this as a bourgeois attitude. They actually see it as human attitude. In other words, it is actually believing that every human being is a bourgeois. You know, that by nature we are bourgeois. So the argument against socialism on those grounds, and the argument, let us say, which says that the tragedy of the commons basically presupposes that everybody by nature is a bourgeois.
But Prabhat, it's not sufficient to say that it's begging the question. You see, the point is, you have to actually supplement that point by pointing out that in many contexts, we actually do not think in a bourgeois or alienated way.
I agree completely. In fact, pre-capitalist societies were characterized by other attitudes. In other words, I'm not.
No, I'm now in
but
capitalist society.
But not attitudes of individual maximization, individual kind of profiteering. I mean, in other words, they may have an other. Okay, feudalism has its own notions of honor, this, that, and the other, but not individual profiteering.
No, I'm not making myself clear, Prabhat. What I'm saying is right now.
Oh yes, I agree with that. I agree with that. That in some frames, everybody, even in a bourgeois society, behaves in a non-bourgeois manner. In fact, I'd go further. I would say that if everybody, society would be impossible if everybody behaved in a bourgeois manner.
Okay, so now, exactly. So now what I'm trying to do is theoretically develop that by saying that there is a background of these habits that you're describing, of what you're calling non-bourgeois thinking, I'm calling unalienated relations, social that there's a whole background of this, without which you could not even have the regulatory aspects of capitalism, which says you can't exceed, you can't refuse to pay taxes, you can't, even the things that capitalism imposes, you couldn't do that without having these things. So we need a theorization of the background and the foreground, and we need to know how one can inform the other in changing the foreground, right? Those are the tasks that I think are relatively under-theorized as yet.
Yeah, there is a pointed question which points to what you just pointed out on the issue of alienatedness from Sandhya, which says that between a neoliberal state and an alienated people, where the state mines alienation through capital flows, how are the habits of unalienation to be arrived at? Especially, it is not to be a programmatic model. How are the habits of unalienated people, publics to be arrived at against the images, practices, temporalities of the everyday already introduced and embedded by capital?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. Prabhat, you want to go first? Let me think about it while you speak.
Well, I think basically people getting together in order to fight the current society itself is an act of going beyond alienation. When people fought in the colonial period against British Raj, they were doing so not because they were expecting personally to gain out of it, but they were doing so, I mean, that was a step beyond individual profiteering, individual maximization, and so on. Now that's a clear example of how we actually take the initial steps. And on the basis of that, I gave the example of Marxist talking about combinations. Individual workers who are informed by the desire to get as high a wage as possible, who are, as it were, imbued with bourgeois values, then come together and gradually shed this. And that's the beginning of a move towards unalienated existence. So I would say that, today, for instance, when you look at the farmers who are gathered around Delhi, they have gathered around for a cause, but not as if every individual is looking at what he or she is going to get out of it. But on the other hand, they're actually subscribing to the totality of the movement. So I think through the movement, through struggle, we overcome or we take the initial steps towards an unalienated existence.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And the question that Sandhya Devasan is asking is answered by what you say, but there's a specific part of the question which talks about the images and practices and temporalities of the everyday as produced by capital. And here I think, what is very interesting, Sandhya, is that if you focus on movements, which by the way is something that Gandhi made central to where people come together in an unalienated way, just as Prabhat was saying. But if you look at the Shaheen Bagh and some of the aspects of that movement, and look at the images, the poetry, the ways in which they presented it, they were fighting these precisely what you're talking about, the images and temporalities and practices, with counter images of the kinds of things Professor Patnaik is meant when he says that you come together in this way of cooperation. And so in a way, going back to Lajwanti's interesting questions about Gandhi's non-cooperation, what's emerging is that Gandhi's non-cooperation was a site of cooperation amongst the struggling people, right? And those movements, especially as you found it last winter, was using images and practices and temporalities in the poetry, in the posters, and so on, which are really images of unalienated social relations. Right? Part of what I was calling the background was emerging in the movements. So I think here there's a real convergence on what may be the answer to where it is to be found. There's a idea of, if you ask yourself what's the difference between movements and parliamentary politics, I think what Professor Patnaik is saying becomes rather more clear, because the kind of thing he's talking about, the solidarities involved, are really much more there in movements than what you find in parliamentary politics.
I think this takes us to another very interesting question by Nitin Jacob, which says, and the question is pointed to Professor Biilgrami. It says that you were defining unalienated life as a matter of habits rather than of laws or conscious principles. As you rightly pointed out, there is unalienated life does not by itself require freedom or equality as descriptions appropriate to it, if not conscious principles. Now, this principle does not always promote habitual belongingness. They sometimes imply conscious ruptures and conflict. In aspiring to take retaining these concepts while recovering unalienated life, do you imagine this concept becoming part of the habits, rendering politics and even morality irrelevant?
So now these principles, so I take it by this, does not by itself require. Yes, it does not. No, I think that the questions that the point that Professor Palshikar made about how unalienated life, if we ever were to achieve that ideal or approximate achieving it in our time, it would nest with freedom and equality. So in the first part of your thing, you say unalienatedness does not by itself require freedom or equality. Well, unalienatedness in the pre-modern sense did not require it. It existed without it. But in the modern period, I'm saying it would have to nest with freedom and inequality. See, my view is that when it is nesting with freedom and equality, it is no longer pre-modern unalienatedness, but also liberty and equality are no longer the bourgeois ideals that Marx dismissed on the Jewish question. They have been transformed because of their relation with unalienatedness. So it's a triangular transformation of all three concepts: liberty, equality, and unalienatedness.
Yeah, Professor Patnaik, any remarks on this?
No, I agree with what Akeel said, because obviously liberty and equality, which Marx critiqued in on the Jewish question, uh, basically he was talking about monads, individuals, still remaining individuals, so that the liberty and equality within liberal thought was one that did not belong to an unalienated universe. I mean, a universe with unalienated lives. So the point is that, you know, it is a triangular transmission. I mean, everything gets transformed because liberty and equality within an unalienated universe has to be different, just as the unalienatedness of an unalienated universe of today would have to be quite different from what existed in pre-modern times, pre-capitalist times. So I agree with what Akeel says.
Yeah, any quick closing comments from Professor Akeel on the question raised? We'll give them briefly, maybe 2-3 minutes each, then we'll close the session.
No, I just want to make a point in passing about what Professor Palchikar said. He was talking about the fact that you know, the essential connectedness is violated by violence. Yes, yes, but the point I was trying to make is that the essential connectedness is violated by competition, and competition is the crux of capitalism. Therefore, you know, we cannot talk about an unalienated life within the parameters of capitalism. That was the only point I was trying to
Yeah.
Yeah, Professor Biilgrami, any closing comment, any closing thoughts?
Well, I'm trying to think about the relationship between, you see, I certainly agree that violence makes the disconnection. But what I don't think we've considered carefully enough, you see, this is a very, very large issue, and I'd be curious to know what both Professor Palchikar and Professor Patnaik think about it. See, it's not just everyday violence, but what we have to not, I think one of the great ways in which we have never followed Gandhi's thinking is that we have very early on, and it's quite possible that Nehru was in fact partly responsible for this. Very early on, we gave up on reconfiguring and re-theorizing the relationship that the state bears to violence. Right? One of the great innovative aspects of Gandhi's thought was to emphasize, and I think Kranti Saran has raised this question as well in what he says in the chat. One of our failures was we simply did not see how much the state's relationship to violence needs to be re-theorized. I mean, just look, I was a kid in my mid to late teens when I saw what was happening with the insurgent left and what the state was doing to the left in the 60s. This is Naxalbari, Telangana, later on in Bihar over the next few years. I mean, this was the state that we have now come to admire so much because of the deteriorations of the last 20 years, but which is the state during the whole earlier period. But just we never overcame the state's relationship to violence in the way that Gandhi was seeking, and I mean, this happened very early on. I mean, Prabhat and I may not agree about this, but if you look at this, Prabhat, you probably know the history of this better, but in the late 30s, Nehru set up something called something to do with a sort of proto-planning group, if you remember.
Yes, yes.
I forget what it was called, NRC or something, and something, right? And Gandhi's ambassador there was Kumarappa, and Nehru himself was chairing it and others. And Kumarappa, I was reading Kumarappa's reports. He said it was just shocking how he was treated as a completely marginal figure. And the idea was that the Soviet model and the large-scale industrialization and the highly centralized, powerful state and all would be absolutely necessary. And all this idea of decentralized thing was completely, just outmoded. And he said, I was treated like a laughingstock, totally marginalized by everybody, virtually everybody else over there. And I think this is just another symptom of the fact that the state's role has not really been properly reconfigured in relationship to violence. And the high mark for me as a kid, when reading about it, was in the 60s and 70s, when the left was the peasantry and the left insurgency of it was subjected to an authoritarian state, which seemed very shocking to us as kids then. But I'm saying it probably goes way back to, and this was not theorized sufficiently.
There's this question from Aniket: would fraternity be a way to talk about ending alienation? Would you like to say something about that, Akeel?
Aniket, that's a very hard and interesting question, but I actually think these are separate ideas. Prabhat and I were part of a panel in which we were supposed to write a long report on notions of belonging and so on. And I was almost dogmatically insistent that we cannot see belonging and unalienatedness as synonymous with solidarity and fraternity. And many people objected to that. When we were, but I really do think that fraternity and unalienatedness are different ideas, because I think fraternity is a moral idea, right? You ought to be in relations of altruism, of compassion, of brotherly feeling, and so on and so forth. Whereas I'm saying that if there's no ought about it. Certain thoughts, what Prabhat is calling bourgeois thinking and I'm calling unalienated thinking, certain thoughts, what if I cooperated and others did not, etc., do not occur to you. It's an epistemological point. It never occurs to you. It's not a moral point saying, I ought not to have it. It doesn't occur to you. And that is a cognitive point. It's an epistemological point. It is, you preempt it. You don't say, don't do it, you preempt it. That's the point of putting it in the background and not a part of formal sanction, norm, and law in the foreground.
But Akeel, while the two are not identical, they're certainly different ideas. But I think fraternity is something which would be a step towards the development of an attitude that leads to unalienated life.
Many things would be steps towards.
That's right.
I mean, many things would be, and if you put it that way, it's a modest way of putting it, and I think that would be right. But I agree with you that it may very well be that something like a classless society or overcoming community production. I mean, don't forget, in Critique of Gotha program, right? Marx actually says, even when, in that last transitional phase that he was theorizing in the Critique of the Gotha program, he says, it's maybe almost impossible to get people to stop thinking that they deserve something for the work they have done. The concept of desert, that I have produced this, I ought to be rewarded or praised for it and so on. This, he says, is a very, in the critique of the Buddha poem, he almost throws up his hand and says, even after classlessness and so on has been said, it would be. So, these things are you have to find a way that it doesn't arise, rather than just say, and I agree with you, getting fraternal relations may be a path to it, but it shouldn't be equated with it. They're different.
No, but I think the critique of Kotha program, something I don't like, by the way. I have very serious problems with the critique of Gotha program, because the stage idea, in other words, Marx throws up his hand, but on the other hand, Marx makes concessions to it in the first stage of socialism, which I don't like.
Just explain that a bit. Explain that a bit.
To each according to his work itself is something which is suggesting that you have to take, that incentives have to be provided, that you have to, that itself is the carryover of a bourgeois attitude. But in fact, on the morning of the revolution, or the morning after the revolution, if you give concessions to bourgeois attitude, you're never going to build socialism. The way I see it.
So, but what has that to do with the stagial way of interpreting?
No. I was saying, in the critique of the Gotha program, the suggestion that there's a stage of socialism when you have.
Yes, yeah, right. Okay, so
that's what I don't agree with.
Yeah, sure, yeah, okay.
Yeah, on this note, Motas Vivendi, we once again thank the two distinguished speakers, Professor Biilgrami and Professor Patnaik, for this very illuminating thoughts and stimulating discussion. We also like to thank the audience for their very substantive questions and for the very overwhelming response we got across the board. I would also like to register my thanks to Professor Sanjay for steering the discussion, and Dr. Anaga for the backroom arrangement and for efficiently executing this academic event. We would certainly look forward to more brainstorming and stimulating discussion and presentation. And we once again thank each and every one of you. Thanks for this event, and have a good evening or good morning wherever you are. Look forward to seeing you again in this platform in the near future. Thank you so much once again, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Akeel.
Thank you, Prabhat sir.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is it still recorded, Anaga?
Yeah. So I
think you can stop. Yeah.